Hello there, this is a book review of Taxes Have Consequences, authored by Laffer, Brian Domitrovic and Jeanne Sinquefield, three PhDs. The most eminent and notable economist among those three clearly is Laffer, very famous for his Laffer curve. If you have studied A-level economics, then you probably would have come across it. He does produce a graph in this book of what that is. It's a very simple concept actually, it's not difficult to understand. But this is the Laffer curve. As you can see there, you have tax rates and revenue. That's the amounts the government collects in taxes, and it produces a bell-shaped curve. So naturally, if the tax rates are zero, the government isn't going to take any money, revenue will be zero. If you increase taxes to 100%, so that people do not earn any money, people don't make any money when they work, quite naturally the revenue will also be zero, because why would people work if they're not going to be paid for that work? So at either end of the curve you have zero revenue, but the idea of the Laffer curve is that there is a Goldilocks zone, an optimal rate or optimal rates that incentivize work and at the same time collect maximum revenue for the government. It's not clear precisely what that figure is. Politics largely is a debate, an argument, if you will, regarding where that Goldilocks zone is. Those on the right tend to prefer lower taxes, particularly in the United States, especially on the libertarian wings of politics. They prefer a smaller state, smaller tax, lower government spending, whereas those on the left traditionally tend to prefer more Keynesian style economics, where tax rates are generally higher, possibly a steeper curve, higher rates on higher earners, so progressive rates of income tax. And so this particularly in recent years, has become quite a contentious issue within the US, but also the UK. This book doesn't talk about the UK at all. This is solely a discussion or a study by the three authors of the income tax in the US. To my surprise, the income tax in the US is quite a recent thing. I always thought that people were being taxed on their income in the 19th century. I don't know why I thought that, but I always had an image in my head of people in the 19th century going about their business and were being taxed on their income. This isn't so. So in 1913, this was when the tax on income was introduced. The reason why it took until quite recently for that to happen was because it was thought unconstitutional to have a tax on earnings, on work and on income. So in 1913 they amended the constitution in the US, and I think it was the 16th amendment enabled Congress, the US government, to tax income. When they first introduced income tax. It was very low, around 7%, and it affected a very small number of people, around 300,000. The population of the US at this time, I think, was around 70 or 80 million. So much less than 1% of the population was affected. And that was the richest segment of the US society that had to fill in a tax form and pay taxes to the government. Soon after, those taxes, from starting so low, were quite quickly ratcheted up to very high numbers. I think in 1918, all of the numbers and all of the statistics are given in great detail in this book. So I'm giving you a sort of overview of the book, so you'll need to check it out. I may be wrong with some of the precise numbers, but I think it was in 1918, at the end of the First World War, when income tax rose dramatically. I think it was higher than 60%. I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head, but it went up very quickly. One of the main arguments Arthur Laffer makes in this book is that taxes generally are a bad thing because they essentially disincentivize work and productive use of human energy. But what he focuses more so in the book is taxes on the richest 1%. And this has become quite a hot topic since 2008, more so in the United States. But one of the arguments he makes is that possibly in a counterintuitive way, it's not the case that increasing taxes on the richest increases revenue. And he actually says that there are a number of harmful effects when you do increase taxes on the rich. The first is that the rich, in lots of different ways, and he gives around 20 and goes into detail, how they shelter their money in various forms, so they're able not to pay the tax rates anyway. Secondly, there's a harmful effect produced by the richest. Instead of putting capital to work in the economy in a real way, in investing in the economy, instead they use their time and energy to hide and protect their wealth. So this has a harmful effect on productivity, and he goes through the entire history, all of the different periods, and looks at, for example, in the 1920s, just prior to the start of that decade, there was a tax cut, and the Roaring Twenties, as they were known, a huge prosperity, which at the end of the decade came to a grinding halt. The worst decade by far in American history was the 1930s, and he, or I should say they, the three authors, primarily attribute that to increase in taxes, starting with the Smoot-Hawley tax. So what they really say in this book is that the Great Depression was primarily caused by taxes. I will just give you an oversight of that. So there was a tax, a tariff rather, called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and let me just read this to give you a quick overview of what that was, because Laffer very much believes this was almost like the first domino on a series of taxes. So all taxes went up throughout the 1930s, partly because the government was seriously worried about the deficit, and they tried to decrease the deficit by raising revenue and they thought that raising taxes would result in increased revenue, but this wasn't the case, primarily for the two reasons I've mentioned. The rich shelter their money, and secondly, it disincentivises work and the productive allocation of capital, which results in employment, efficiency, and economic growth. But let me just give you a quick oversight of the Smoot-Hawley, because I hadn't heard of it before reading this book. So let me just see if I can get it. So the first devastating tax increase was the tariff on traded products, the Tariff Act of June 1930. Often this law goes by the name of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, after the surnames of its sponsors, whom we shall introduce below. Typical for tariffs of its day, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff had three parts. The first, the longest, was a list of products taxed at rates specific to them. The second was a blanket rate for all manufactured items left off the specific list. The third was a list of products exempted from the tariff, called the free list. The average tax rate in the first part was about 60%. The blanket rate was 20%. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was very long, 90-some pages of dense script enumerating the specific taxes. Like all tariffs, it makes for curious reading. The specificity was microscopic, as in this representative passage. Handkerchiefs, wholly or in part of lace, and handkerchiefs embroidered, whether with a plain or fancy initial monogram or otherwise, and whether or not the embroidery is on a scalloped edge, tamboured, appliqued, or from which threads have been omitted, drawn, punched or cut, and with threads introduced, after weaving to finish or ornament the open work, not including one row of straights, hemstitching, adjoining the hem, all the foregoing, finished or unfinished, or whatever material composed, value at not more than 70 cents per dozen, 3 cents each, and 40 per centum ad valorem. So it's a bit facetious, the specifics of this bill, looking at handkerchiefs and applying the tax specifically to them. Is just an example of what this bill encompassed, which was a general increase in taxations on a number of different products. And this was introduced in 1930. And then the stock market witnessed a huge crash. He has produced a graph, so if you take a look at this graph, the grey bar is the time when the Smoot-Hawley tariff is being implemented, and the wavered line, I think, is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So you can see a huge decline in the stock market. So this is how he sees the onset of the Great Depression. And then, so there was the tariff and the unfolding realisation in 1931, given the staggered nature of the federal fiscal year and tax payment due dates, that a major receipts and economic problem was brewing. The enormous tax increases on income, estates, and all the rest, as of January the 1st, 1932, that ensured that productive capital was withdrawn from the economy to a degree unimaginable before. So this is essentially what the authors attribute the Great Depression to was taxes, which is fascinating. He does briefly talk about how gold played a role in this as well, because prior to 1933, what was happening in the author's view was that as tax rates were increasing, the richest were buying gold. And at the time, prior to 1933, there was a fixed rate for gold, so the dollar was on the gold standard. And so what was happening was that a lot of rich people were buying gold Now, if you imagine what that means, gold is a non-productive asset. You know, if you imagine you've got a bar of gold or a block of gold in your hand, that's not going to do anything for the economy. It's not an investment in the economy. It's not a productive allocation of capital. So he doesn't quite state this explicitly, but those on the other side of the argument, because in 1933, the US government announced that everyone had to exchange their gold. They had to take the US government took the gold from all Americans. I think it was if you had over $1,000 worth, there was a certain threshold above which this law applied. But so the US government told everyone they had to give their gold in, and they would receive, I think it was $20.67 per ounce, so just over $20. And then I think it was a year later, the US government announced that the dollar, essentially it was a devaluation, and that the fixed price for gold became $35. So if you imagine, Americans gave in their gold, got $20.67, and then a year later, essentially the US government said, well, actually the gold's worth $35. In other words, the dollar was depreciated. And so the authors of this book have said that that was a wealth tax, because you had to give your gold in, otherwise you would be imprisoned. So the US government had the gold, and then a year later, the dollar was devalued, so the $20.67 that you got relative to gold wasn't worth as much. It was considerably less relative to gold. That's a massive increase from $20.67 to $35. So, because if you look into the Great Depression, many people attribute the dollar being on the gold standard as being a major factor. And if one is trying to understand the way the US government fought at the time, the severity of this measure to demand all gold be handed in, I mean, that's quite an extreme measure, can only have come about if they genuinely believed that this was what was happening. The Great Depression, because there was deflation as well, because dollars were being converted into gold, people were buying gold, and therefore with less money in the economy, prices go down, all else being equal. And so this, from the US government's point of view, was the crux of the problem, and that there was an issue with money flowing, and people spending, and the economy, money in circulation, because money was being parked in a static entity, gold. This is not going to drive commerce and business and consumerism, etc., etc. So it's worth looking into that. He does go into that in the book. So the 1930s are particularly interesting because they were absolutely terrible. Unemployment was 25%. That's a quarter of people unemployed, and absolute disaster. And the authors, they attribute that mostly to increase in taxes during the 1930s. They go into the 1940s. Generally, they say the 1940s were much better as a result of tax decreases. And, oh, by the way, so those were the two main things during the Depression: gold confiscation at $20.67 per ounce, upwards of $6 billion in monetary value transferred to federal government when official price rose from $20.67 to $35 per ounce the following year. All gold clauses in contracts were voided. So then there was a Revenue Act of 1934. This increased the progressivity of the income tax, kept top rate at 63%. So at this time, the top rate of income tax was 63%. took top estate tax rate from 45 to 60%. There was the Reciprocal Tariff Act, June 1934, gave executive authority to reduce tariffs on goods coming from individual countries. Major partners such as Cuba negotiated deals in 1934, Britain and Canada soon after. Revenue Act of 1935 took top income tax rate up from 63 to 79%, corporate rates more progressive. Revenue Act of 1936 reduces personal dividend tax, replacing it with a corporate surtax of 27% on undistributed profits. So there's a number of taxes which increased during the 1930s. 1940s, there were some tax reductions which result in greater economic boom, more growth. He is not as optimistic regarding the 1950s, or his take on the 1950s, and he was alive during the 1940s as well. I think Arthur Laffer was born in the early 1940s, so he experienced this, and this is why I decided to buy the book, was because not only, if you look at the CV of the author, he is one of the most eminent, highly acclaimed economists of modern times, particularly regarding his role in governmental policy. So he was a special advisor to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. The 1980s were a massive boom in terms of economic growth. Unemployment went down, and the US, the growth rate was much higher in the period from 1980 to 2000. But the 1950s, he says that they weren't as great as everyone sort of remembers them, in a sense, or is believed to have been in modern times. The 1960s, he recognised at JFK his tax reductions produced much better performance in the 1960s. Goes into quite some detail about the 1970s, stagflation, higher taxes, lower growth, high inflation, the dollar losing a considerable amount of its purchasing power in that period from the late 60s to the 1980s. And then you have the period Ronald Reagan, much lower taxes. He dramatically reduces taxes across the board until 2000, and then he looks at 2000 until recently. So it's an excellent book. You know, a lot of people wouldn't naturally gravitate possibly to a book on taxes. It's not arguably the most exciting subject to read about. But actually, the authors do an excellent job in making what is otherwise quite a dry and mundane topic alive. They really bring it alive. And it's quite interesting to read about American history through the eyes of taxes in the 20th century. So it's a fascinating read. I highly recommend it. It is a little bit biased towards the views of the authors. Arthur Laffer, he has worked with Democrats as well as Republicans. And by the way, if you want to, and I would highly recommend finding him on YouTube. You can see many interviews that he's done, speeches, incredibly bright person, incredibly someone who enjoys the subject very much, and you hear him talking about economics, and it's quite a remarkable person to listen to because you can clearly see he enjoys it so much. His passion for the subject is inspiring, actually, and he really knows his stuff. But they make it fun to read, but they are, in a sense, I would say, on the more libertarian side of the spectrum, in the sense that they have criticised Keynesian economics and big government spending as largely being wasteful and not being an efficient, productive use of capital. Anyway, so if you want to read a book about taxes, about income tax specifically, this would be a great book to read. Thank you.